Hi to everyone, and a warm welcome to the wide audience who follow us on social media right now or have registered beforehand and directly participate on today's panel discussion. Today is 12th of June, and I'm glad to state that from now on, Eastern European Network for Citizenship Education starts a new project titled eenceclub, which will last till November. Twice a month, we will have an online events. eenceclub aims at promotion of democratic development and citizenship education through creation of space for public debates and experience sharing. All eenceclub themes focused on sustainable development goals of UN SDGs. Today, with a great panelist and moderator, we will speak up about SDG number 5, that is gender equality and women empowerment. Together with the panelists coming from the UK, Czech Republic, Belarus, and Georgia, we will dive in and discuss certain components of gender justice, women's rights, equal opportunities, and much more from different perspectives and triangles, from policy to practice, from challenges to opportunities. eenceclub is organized by EENCE in the framework of Citizenship Education Week, Art of Living Online, and supported by Federal Agency for Civic Education, BPB, using the funds that are coming from Federal Foreign Office. Some technical announcement. So the panel discussion will last exactly 1 hour, but don't worry, because after that we will have 30 minutes for Q&A session. So if you have any question, please address it at the chat box at Zoom or drop your question in a comment box at social media if you follow us on Facebook, or simply unmute yourself and directly ask it during Q&A session. It's important that if your question is addressed to a specific panelist, please mention it. Also present yourself by addressing a question, your name, surname, country, organization, if any. The panel discussion, including Q&A session, is moderated by Ani Gojoyan. Ani is a gender, education, and communication studies expert, as well as researcher for more than 10 years experience. Ani is a lecturer at Yerevan State University. At the same time, she is an expert and trainer at Youth Power NGO and leading expert and trainer at EENCE Working Group Women in Local Communities. Let me introduce shortly the organizer of whole eenceclub project. This is in Eastern European Network for Citizenship Education, which history goes back to 2015. The mission of the network is to have a tangible contribution to the sustainable development of the civil society in the Eastern Partnership region and Russia through widening the citizenship education sphere and developing the capacity of the institutions and experts in the field. If you are interested to become a partner organization or a member of the network as an individual expert or organization, please check the details at www.eence.eu. This year will be full of different activities. One of them is Excel and Elevate, which is going to be a master class activities, and also we are having a lot of competitions within Citizenship Education Week. So you are free to become an expert, speaker, trainer, as well as just the participants of these amazing events. Please consult the official webpage, again, eenc.eu for more details. And last but not least, I am Narina Teknajan, the co-founder and trainer at Youth Power NGO, also member of EENCE Coordination Council, leader at EENCE Working Group Women in Local Communities, and at the same time, the project manager of eenceclub behalf of Coordination Council. I wish us a useful and productive panel discussion and leave a floor to Ani Ojoyan.
Thank you, Narina, and hello, everyone. And thanks for joining us today. Let's continue our EENCE event. As Narina mentioned, I'm Ani, and I will be the moderator for today's discussion. Today's discussion is organized by Citizenship Education for Sustainable Development, and which focuses today on women's rights and women issues conditioned by COVID-19, and not only. We will focus on much more. Thanks, Narnia, once again for your warm welcome and introduction, as well as brief but at the same time comprehensive introduction to the scope of EENCE activities and upcoming events. As Narina mentioned, for this series of EENCE's discussion, we have chosen UN SDG Sustainable Development Goals. And very briefly, just a few words I would like to mention why exactly. Actually, there has been kind of like a decision to choose UN CDGs as conceptual framework for EENCE discussions. Conceptually, by this I mean like covering each EENCE discussion will cover a variety of questions thematically connected with sustainable development goals. And today we will focus on number 5, which is gender equality, women issues, and women rights. And now, please join me, everyone, to welcome our audience and our brilliant speakers who come from different countries, from UK, Czech Republic, and Belarus, plus Georgia. These amazing women are scholars, experts, and activists in the field. Thank you, dear colleagues, for your support and for your willingness to join us today and share your experiences, thoughts, opinions, and approaches and insights into the topic. So please welcome our first speaker. Our first speaker is Ryan. Dr. Ryan is from the UK, who has 15 years of experience of research and activism in gender-based violence. She has also taught at universities. She is currently a postdoc fellow research on sexual harms and medical encounters project at University of London. And she's also a trade union organizer and activist. Our next speaker is Katerina. Please welcome Katerina, who is from Czech Republic, who has been active as a gender expert since 2010. From 2011 to 2018, Katerina served as the director of Czech NGO Gender Information Center, NORAM. Since the onset of her involvement in gender issues, she has specialized in gender equality in the labor market and participated in numerous gender audits in different types of organizations, such as ministries, local authorities, academic institutions, local and international organizations and companies. And finally, our third speaker is Marina. She's from Belarus and Georgia. She's leading the campaign March Bay, advocating for the law on encountering domestic violence in Belarus. She runs empowerment and leadership courses for women from civil society organizations, political parties, grassroots movements, and underrepresented groups in Eastern Partnership countries. And I also would like to mention that she has recently completed her research on women's movements in the Eastern Partnership countries, from personal story to theory construction, where she interviewed about their stories more than 20 active feminist or feminist activists and leaders of contemporary feminist movements from Armenia, Belarus, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Moldova, and Ukraine. So thank you, ladies. Thank you very much for joining us today. And before we continue our discussion, let me also introduce the structure and agenda of our event to our audience. So, dear participants and audience, we will move with a discussion with our speakers. I have prepared certain questions to to them. They will have a chance to answer these questions. But at the end, they will also have a chance to reflect on each other's sayings or answers, responses. Then at the end, we will have Q&A session with the audience. So we'll have a chance to get questions from you. But if you still have questions, content-related questions to our discussion while our speakers present their approaches and answer the questions, please do not hesitate to put your questions in the chat box. I, as a moderator, with the help of Marina, will collect the questions. And at the end, again, our speakers and panelists will have a chance to answer them as well. So if this part is clear, I would suggest to continue with the event. But I also know that our panelists have also prepared, I believe, certain objects. They brought some certain objects with them that they associate somehow with the topic. And I would also like, once they have a chance to answer the questions, just to present very shortly in a few seconds that specific object, what it is about. So let's start a discussion. Today we're going to talk on gender equality issues, particularly focusing on women's rights and issues. We all know that gender equality is a fundamental human right, but at the same time, it is a foundation for a peaceful, prosperous, and sustainable and better world. This is what the UN actually Sustainable Development Goals state and claim. However, we all know that the coronavirus, the pandemic, has put the sustainability and prosperity of everything at risk. COVID-19 has hit all the aspects of our lives and creating new challenges and worsening the existing problems, deepening the existing problems. And the effects of COVID-19 serve kind of like a true obstacle, hinder to gender equality and women's rights progress in general. Today, I invite us all to discuss these issues, but also some other issues as well, connected again with women's rights and issues connected with women. So I have got a question, and the first question is actually addressed to all our speakers. Before jumping into the COVID-specific questions, how COVID affected women's issues and rights, now let's first of all try to understand what are the main issues and topics on the agenda of women's rights movements in your country or in your region. For this, each speaker will have 6 minutes. I will follow strictly the time. And once we run the time, I will just show with my hand gesture. So please, who would like to start the question, the answer to the question? So what are the main topics and issues on the agenda of women's rights movements in your country or in your region? Who would like to start? Katerina, please. Yes. And with the object, if you brought some object with you, starting probably with this.
Thank you very much for giving the floor to me. I've got a book. I'm not sure if you're able to see that book. It's a Milkman. It's called, the title is Milkman. The book has been written by Anna Burns. And why have I taken this object with me? It has more reasons. First of all, I'm a fan of reading. I love reading when I have time. And the second reason is connected that in our context, books are relevant for education or have some relevance for education. And that's how I would like, in fact, to start my intervention, because for, let's say, 2 decades, more women than men have tertiary education in the Czech Republic. At the moment, I would say nearly 60% of university graduates are formed by women. What the problem is in our context in the Czech Republic is that women, female graduates, they can't capitalize on their education. So in fact, I'm going to discuss the critical issues related to gender equality from two perspectives, because as Annie has mentioned, I'm an activist. It means I'm involved in activities of the non-governmental sector in the Czech Republic. In fact, for years I've been working for the non-governmental organization called Gender Information Center NORA. At the same time, I have been employed as a gender expert by the Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs. So I would like to raise certain critical issues in the field of gender equality from these two perspectives, as an activist in a non-governmental sector and also as an expert working for the state administration. So what are the critical topics, critical issues of our women's movement? I'm going to speak about the Czech Republic. So first of all, gender pay gap, I will come back to it. Then a ratification of the Istanbul Convention, if I'm not sure. So on the 11th of May, 10 years ago, on the 11th of May, the Council of Europe Istanbul Convention was signed, and the Czech Republic has signed the Istanbul Convention, however, hasn't ratified it. So it's another issue. Then regarding the education, the Czech Women's Lobby has established recently a working group on the topic of gender-sensitive education, and we are about to form a platform of experts and stakeholders in this field, because we find it's a crucial issue, because gender stereotypes, they stem also in the preschool education, and we can find them everywhere in the school system. And last but not least, the Czech Women's Lobby is very active in the topic of reproductive rights. And I'll come back to that later, because this topic was affected during the COVID-19 pandemic. However, I've got some figures regarding the gender pay gap. I've prepared some figures for you, because the Czech Republic within the EU countries has been doing really badly. For like nearly 2 decades, the Czech Republic occupied the second worst position, and the level of the gender pay gap reached more than 20% in my country. The situation has improved slightly recently, thanks to several initiatives or several phenomena. Since 2016, the Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs has been implementing a very complex ministerial project called 22% to Equality. And within that project, a very systemic approach towards tackling the gender pay gap in the Czech Republic has been taking place. Lately, also in the Czech Republic, in the sectors where we can see the predominance of women, so the income was improved. The wages and salaries of women working in health sector and in education has risen recently. So, and it's another factor contributing to a lower level of gender pay gap in the Czech Republic. And then the third main factor is the rise in the minimum wage. And shortly, I believe I still have 2 minutes left. Thank you very much. And I would like to go back to causes of the gender pay gap, because the gender pay gap is a very complex phenomenon. And in fact, when you have a look, investigate the causes, it gives you a very clear picture of gender equality in the country. So In the Czech Republic, the labor market is extremely segregated, both horizontally and vertically. Then, in the Czech Republic, women have very little possibilities for childcare facilities. We have, thanks to the upbringing in families and also thanks to our education system, we have very gender stereotypical career. We take very gender stereotypical career choices, and the division of care is extremely unequal in my country. And last but not least, our pay systems are totally non-transparent, and I hope that the Commission, the directive of the European Commission has prepared, is about to change the situation in regarding this transparency. But I'll just come back to that later if I have the chance. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Katerina, very much for this kind of like introduction to gender issues in your country. So from Katerina, we learned we have this, we just mentioned briefly the following issues: gender gap, gender sensitive education, and Istanbul Convention as well. Issues, which is again a problem in Armenia as well. Again, we have cited, but we have ratified it as well. And there are lots of other problems with this, but we'll probably have a chance to come back to this. What about Ryan? In your case, what are these basic and main topics and issues on the agenda of women's rights movement in the UK?
Sure. So I think I wanted to talk really about gender-based violence in the UK. So I'm a scholar. I work on sexual violence, predominantly in post-colonial settings, but I've also done a lot of work for NGOs in the UK around sexual and domestic violence, including sort of frontline kind of survivor services and also kind of policy development. So I wanted to speak about that really, and I think that's probably a theme that's going to come up a few times over the course of the discussion today. But I wanted to start, I guess, by talking about the fact that still in the UK, 2 women a week are still killed by their partner or their ex-partner. There've been some changes to those figures as a result of the pandemic, and we'll talk about that later. But on average, 2 women a week are still killed by a partner or ex-partner. This is a kind of high rate of domestic murder, which is kind of set against a background of massive funding cuts for services. So the funding for refuge accommodation, so safe accommodation for survivors of violence, has been cut by a quarter since 2010. And we really have a justice system here that fails survivors. So thinking about sexual violence, currently the latest figures are only 1.5% of rapes recorded by police in England and Wales resulted in any kind of criminal conviction in 2019. So one of the concerns for the feminist movement here is that essentially rape is decriminalized because 1.5% of reported rapes. So that's the ones recorded by police, and we know that that's a really small number of the actual rapes that are perpetrated. Only 1.5% actually resulted in a conviction in 2019. So it's fairly clear, I think, that the justice system isn't working for women in the UK, even on its own terms. So I think kind of one of the things that we need to be thinking about is kind of transformative justice approaches, because women are not getting justice through the criminal justice system. So what might alternatives to that look like? I think one of the most urgent things that's kind of on my mind as an activist at the moment is actually the police sentencing and courts bill, which, for those of you maybe not familiar with UK politics, it's a proposed law and it seeks to increase police powers in a way that will have a real devastating intersectional impact So it's particularly going to impact the lives of people whose kind of lives are touched more by interactions with the police. So Black, Muslim, Gypsy, Roma, and traveller communities. It also gives police extended stop and search powers and criminalises the right to protest. So that's going to impact all of us, from trade unions to women fighting for social justice. And this is, I think, of particular concern to the feminist movement. In March, we had a murder case which I think made some international headlines. It was a particularly devastating case of a 33-year-old woman called Sarah Everard, who was killed in March. And this week, a serving police officer has actually pled guilty to her rape and kidnap. He hasn't yet entered a plea on that murder. But a vigil which was led by the grassroots activist group Sisters Uncut to pay their respects to Sarah and other women killed by men. And I'm going to mention here the names of some women of colour. So Biba Henry and Nicole Smallman and Blessing Olusegun. Those vigils descended into police brutality, ostensibly because that vigil breached COVID-19 restrictions. So there's kind of that civil liberty agenda too. So I guess for us right now, state, police and gender-based violence are really high on the agenda. And in particular, that'll be an issue in the coming months around this proposed increase in police powers.
Thank you, Ryan. That's very exciting to hear about this systemic failures and how the systems fell, and also, as mentioned, massive cuttings to services, which is really important for fighting gender inequality and gender-based violence in cases and issues. But yeah, this is the reality, and we need to face it, and we need to think of our insights and opportunities, how we could mitigate the risk or some kind of like neutralize, if not just being able to solve the whole problem entirely. Thank you for this insight. And Marina, what about your case? What about Belarus and Georgia? Because Marina, today she presents two countries simultaneously, and she will have just much more also to share with us, connected with this women issues, what issues we have on the agenda of women's movements in Belarus and Georgia. Marina, we have again 6 minutes.
Yeah. Yeah, before I was asked to cover the whole region, the Eastern Partnership countries. So it's not only Belarus and Georgia, but maybe I will start outlining some of the things that are very general, very common for all of the countries. Right? Yeah. So on the gender-based violence is a huge issue everywhere. And I think now it's also sort of a trend also in feminist movements to unite and do something, coordinate somehow, and think actually strategically what could be done. But in the region, we have such a diverse, like we have a huge number of gender-based violence, yes, but we have very, very different situations at the moment. So for example, Belarus is not even thinking about Istanbul Convention. This is such a faraway perspective. I don't know if we will be able to, of course, if we will have the transformation now, if we will have different people in power, so there will be like many more chances to actually get to this point. But we are not even approaching it. Yes, then in other countries, like in 2020, 2019, there were actually many marches and many advocacy campaigns for also ratifying and then also improving the implementation of the Istanbul Convention, how do you say, Istanbul Convention principles in the countries. But they all failed, also because of COVID, and also because the feminist agenda and the women's rights agenda became, I don't know, in the top news was actually not super high. Yes, maybe probably only the gender-based violence in some of the countries, but all the focus and all the news were about elections, they were about COVID, and unfortunately, women's rights, we have the roll-up in discussions on women's rights. So In Belarus, also the issue is that we have a huge problem with the trust towards the police. So even now, we never had lockdown. So this is something that all the countries were making jokes about, because the Lukashenko, he was making lots of jokes, and he was actually saying that, yeah, that COVID does not exist. And so we just, please people, drink some vodka, work on the tractor in the field, and it will be fine. Yes, so nothing to be afraid of, which actually had very negative impact on everything that was happening. But of course, in terms of being locked down, people were not locked down. So of course, many activists, they wanted to self-isolate, but we didn't have this kind of closure. Yes. So actually, people still didn't have this kind of thing when they had to spend lots of time together in one flat. So we didn't register the increase in the cases of domestic violence, for example. But when the revolution started, so then now we have lots of issues, because, for example, after the tortures and after what happened, yes, after the police violence, women, they are not very eager to seek for help at the police. So we have to really transform the whole system, and we have to think what to do about that. Another thing, of course, is the economic disempowerment that happened to women, especially in the last year, and especially in terms of losing the jobs, or not, or being underpaid, even being at the front line of addressing COVID-19 pandemic, like in the healthcare, but also unpaid labor, yes, unpaid domestic labor. And I will tell you the story because many of my friends, they work for the international organizations, which are also working on SDG 5. And even in the office of the international organizations, what is happening is that, for example, women, they stay at home and they start replying to emails at 9 p.m. because in the morning they have to take care of kids, they have to feed everyone, then they have to do lots of household chores, then at some moment they have also to help the kids with the online schooling, because this is something that is actually, yes, something that government had to do but resigned, so all this burden is on women. And then so when women have free time, it's actually 9 p.m. So then they start doing their job. So this is a huge, huge issue that demonstrates that we have to rethink the whole system, yes, and how it works. And we have to redistribute the gender roles, the way they're organized in all of our countries. And we really have to be strategic and thoughtful.
Thank you, Marina.
Lots of other issues, but maybe we'll
sure.
talk about them also in the discussion.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thanks for raising this familiar issues and questions, actually, that most of us probably have faced during this pandemic. And the question you mentioned about this double burden, it's not only even double burden, it's, I don't know, triple, or it's even much more. And we also have some statements, official statements and research results already coming from different countries with the results, how this particularly affected, whatever you said, female scholars who started publishing much less compared with male scholars who really have this time enjoying their so-called like enjoying time at home and publishing lots of papers, reading aloud, while female scholars just simply needed to do their household chores and issues, and plus also their work, and simply didn't have really much time to publish, and which also resulted on their professorship and some positions at universities. Thank you for raising these questions. And now let's move on. I have got, Marisha, a very provocative question for you. But before, because Katrina showed the specific object and we just forgot in your case and Ryan's case, if you brought that very specific object which you associate with today's topic, still you have this time. Katrina showed the book also. Okay, so you will have a chance just to, in a few seconds, also explain what associations it has got with the topic. But I also have a question for you, which I know is a little bit provocative, but yet, do you think that COVID really impacted women much more and much harder than men? This is because this is kind of like a question we got from policymakers a lot, and in general from public, in particular from men. And now let's try to discover together as experts and scholars or experts in the field. Was it the case? What do you think?
Of course, when we started raising the issue of impact of COVID-19 pandemic on women, we got, of course, the wave of angry men saying that no, it's not true because men are mostly dying from COVID. And here we have to, I mean, at least in the region, yes, because in our region, people are quite gender blind, governments are quite gender blind, and the decisions they're making are really disregarding very often the gender differences. So, but if we look, for example, at the sector of care and the sector of services, there are mostly women working there. And actually, what also COVID showed with the lockdowns and very inappropriate measures in some cases, is that the groups that were already vulnerable, they became even more vulnerable because of the restrictions and because of the pandemic, yes, of the consequences. The thing is also that, for example, in most of the sectors in the healthcare, there are more than 60% of women working. I think in some of the sectors, even 80%, yes, especially at the front line, yes, healthcare. Then, of course, women had to take care of kids. Then there was a huge issue with political participation, for example, because this was also quite difficult. What was happening, for example, that in some countries, because of the elections, the pandemic was actually increased, you know, like because the countries, they really wanted to have the elections, so they really postponed and they didn't introduce some of the measures just because they wanted people to go and vote. Yes, and because of that, in some of the countries, we had huge issues that impacted everyone, especially women. But unfortunately, people don't recognize, and they say that, yeah, actually men are suffering more, but in terms of the long-term consequences, in terms of the stress, in terms of the post-traumatic syndrome disorder that we are going to have, we will have lots of negative impact on women, because they had to deal with all this care, they had to deal with the kids, they had also to work, they had to do too many things during the pandemic, and they didn't get much support from the governments, unfortunately.
Thank you, Marina, for this insight. My next question goes to Ran. We already talked somehow how the pandemic influenced the whole situation, and you also talk about sexual harassment and sexual cases, and also gender-based violence. And we all know that due to this strong stay-at-home restrictions, and there has been this very sad but yet dramatic increase in gender-based violence. I would like you to specifically concentrate now on this impact or impacts. What has been the impact of COVID-19 on the situation of gender equality, and particularly on women's issues, and also on gender-based violence, as you already mentioned briefly. But now we have this time already to focus specifically on this question.
Sure. So I think there are a huge range of issues that we could talk about, and it's hard to sort of pick a few for 6 minutes, because I think this is a whole day-long discussion, really, rather than an hour and a half. But I think one thing that I wanted to mention was around sort of employment rights and labour rights. So we also have a gender pay gap in the UK. So Katerina was talking about the situation in Czech Republic. So we've got a pay gap of about 10% if you compare men and women's hourly rates. But if you then take into account the fact that women do more part-time work, it increases to 30%. So it's quite significant. Unfortunately, the government has decided to suspend all reporting on the gender pay gap during the pandemic. So there's a legal duty for all companies with more than 250 employees to publish their gender pay gap data, but that was suspended for last year due to the pandemic, and it's been suspended in 2021 as well. So we're probably just not going to know what the impact has been, and I think that's the case for a lot of things. We probably won't know the longer term impact for women for a long time. But talking about labour rights, women were far more likely during the pandemic to be made redundant than men were. The homeschooling and the childcare demands, as Marisha was talking about, also fell disproportionately on women. Women were also more likely to have to take time off work with no pay to care for the children during pandemic. We also know that women and disabled workers and people of colour are more likely to be employed on particularly precarious contracts. So whether that's kind of 0 hours where you don't have any guaranteed shifts or other forms of precarious work. Women are disproportionately affected by that, and we saw real impacts of the pandemic on those forms of work. So increased unemployment, often people don't have access to even sick pay. So if you get COVID, you don't get paid. So people were turning up to work with COVID because they had no alternative, and we know that those impacts fell disproportionately onto women. I also wanted to talk a little about reproductive rights. So sexual health clinics in many areas were shut, either because of staff shortages or because it just wasn't practical for them to operate. There were difficulties for women in more remote areas traveling to clinics. Difficulties with access to contraception because those clinics were closed, and some issues, both kind of legal and in terms of physical access to abortion and other reproductive rights services as well. And then sort of finally, I guess, coming back to the issue of gender-based violence, there has been a massive uptick in gender-based violence as a result of the pandemic and the lockdowns that we saw in the UK, which have been quite severe in some cases. So Refuge, which is one of the main NGOs working on domestic violence in the UK, saw its sort of national domestic violence helpline website. It had an increase of 300% of visitors in the early stages of the first lockdown. And we've also seen fewer refuge spaces being available to women attempting to flee violence. So about a 42% reduction, owing to the social distancing and the government guidance, which meant that you couldn't have so many women in a particular accommodation. And this is against, again, the backdrop of devastating cuts that I mentioned over the last 10 years, where we already had a situation where 50% of women are being turned away from refuge because of lack of availability. And there's also been difficulty, I think, in delivering services. So there's been a switch to remote services, but that's been really underfunded, and also it's not reaching the most vulnerable women. So I was working in the early stages of the pandemic with particularly homeless women, and they simply don't have access to sort of online means that services were switching to, so that caused some real issues. And I think I'm out of time, so yeah, that's my 6 minutes, but there's a lot to say.
Sure, I'm sure. And what I would suggest also later, once we're done with the discussion, if our speakers, panelists have valuable resources, links that they think they are worth sharing with our audience, please send all the links or report or whatever resources you find it like really useful to share with our audience, or whatever is left and you didn't have a chance to continue and talk on it, please share with us, with Noreen and me, and we'll kindly forward it to our participants and we'll post it on our social media page. Thank you, Maria. And the same question goes to Katerina. So Katerina, you mentioned about a number of issues on the agenda of women's rights movements in general in your country, but what was the impact of the pandemic on the situation of women's rights that particularly and mostly affected that sphere in your country?
I would like to agree with what Marisha has just has said in her intervention. What has happened in the Czech Republic, that other topics have taken over And human rights issues or women's rights simply are not that much on the agenda. Unlike Ryan, the gender pay gap topic is still on the agenda and still remains the focus. However, it's only thanks to the activities of the ministerial project, which I have already mentioned. The project is called 22% to equality. In relation to the pandemic, COVID-19, I would like to raise two issues that we had to solve or that we had to face during the pandemic or the Czech women's movement. One, I'm not sure, it might be quite unique for the Czech Republic. At the very beginning of the pandemic, the government banned the presence of fathers in maternity hospitals while giving birth. Yeah. And that was the moment when human rights activists and the Czech women's lobby had to intervene, because the human rights were violated, and also the Commissioner for Human Rights, she supported the cause. So it was like, yeah, probably the first issue connected with the consequences of the pandemic COVID-19 in the Czech Republic, the ban of the presence of fathers in maternity hospitals. And then the second issue, which we had to take up very quickly at the beginning of the pandemic, or even during the pandemic, new, let's say, boards, new committees, and so on are coming up to solve this issue, to solve that issue, and so on. And in most of the committees and on the boards, there's the underrepresentation of women. So that was another issue which the Czech women's movement had to fight for. And also, I would like to mention that I definitely believe, I'm persuaded, is just that the consequences of the current pandemic, fall more heavily on women. And I would like to just again state at least two reasons for that. In the Czech country, the distribution of care is totally uneven between men and women. And then the sectors of economy where women work, as health sector, education, but also services, have been definitely more hit by the pandemic than other sectors. For example, just imagine in my country, industry. In fact, there was a short lockdown in the industry. However, most men just work in the industry, so they could just continue working, while a lot of sectors, right, like restaurants or tourism, were a lot of shops were closed, and simply those women stayed at home with very little financial support. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Katerina. Thank you. All the questions you raised are really important, and I believe most of them are shared with all of us in our countries. I have got the last question to all our speakers, actually. So the last question is kind of like in reference to the future. I really wanted to hear your opinion. What are the areas where feminist movements and women communities either are planning or should plan to invest their efforts in the nearest future and in the post-pandemic period? So I would like probably to give a chance to Marisha to talk on this issue. What do you think, Marisha, where we need to invest more in the near future?
Yes, so what this year revealed is that, of course, we have to work, and this is something that feminist movements are saying, we have to work a lot on increasing the representation of women in decision-making bodies, because male governments showed how inefficient they are, unfortunately. And this is very logical in dealing with the different crisis situations. So what we have to focus on is really to empower women and really provide the space for women opportunities to enter the government. Yes, so there can be different ways how to do it. Some people say about quotas, or I don't know, some other instruments, but this is very obvious, because otherwise the voices of women will be never heard, and then the decisions are made not based on the needs of women. Even I would say anti-women decisions are made. For example, I was very shocked. I was very surprised that, for example, in Georgia, I was observing that it was reported that there was lack of access to the reproductive health services. So, for example, if a woman would like to have an abortion, it was quite complicated, quite challenging, yes. But at the same time, what was available, beauty salons. So women have to be beautiful. They have to take care of their hair, you know, like makeup and so on. But they have issues with having an abortion, which can actually improve the situation for many women that ended up in economic despair. So this is something that seems very illogical to me, and I think that it has to be corrected somehow. Another thing, of course, is the amount of sexism is horrible. The amount of assault is horrible. So this is something that feminist movements are going to fight about, and this is something that will be happening, of course. Another thing is, of course, increasing the visibility and impact of women, especially in the crisis situation. And even in Belarus, that is proclaimed to be a feminist revolution, women's revolution, it is not, unfortunately. So we still have to really prove that there was a huge impact of women on social transformation. Of course, the security of feminist activists. This is something also, this is the issue, and this is something that we observed in Ukraine. This is something we observed in Armenia, in Belarus, in Azerbaijan. So this is something that we have to work on, yes, a lot. So we have to think how to ensure that women and feminist activists, they don't get attacked by anti-gender movements that we have now. I can speak for hours, yes, but this, I think, very important things
are really, really important, and particularly the last one, which is again a shared experience in a number of countries in the region. And there has been kind of like attacks, and sometimes massive attacks on women activists and women human rights defenders. And this is a huge, huge problem that we need to really think over deeply. Thanks. What about Ren? In your case, what do you think? Where it is that we feminists and we women communities need to invest in the near future? In which areas?
Sure. I mean, there's so much, isn't there? There are so many things that we need to do. But I think one of the things that I've been thinking about recently, and I think maybe particularly in the UK context, and how feminism has been organised, and how we might need to do that differently. So I think there are a lot of kind of single issue campaigns. So people will organise around a particular piece of legislation or around a particular issue, and then that kind of momentum is lost. So I think one of the things that's really important is to sort of think about how we organize and build for that kind of in the longer term in our communities, particularly at the local level, so that we have kind of structures for kind of proactively organizing rather than just reacting to events. And I think that's kind of thinking about what we need to do in the longer term. But I guess, there's kind of that thing, isn't there, where the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and now the kind of second best time is today. So it's just kind of thinking about how we can have the structures in place, I think, to be able to kind of organize and have those structures in place in communities rather than simply kind of responding to single issues. And I think, as sort of the other speakers have mentioned, the issue of gender-based violence is huge. It's a huge issue across the world. It's a huge issue in the UK. we have a new Domestic Abuse Act, which came into law at the end of April, and it brought in some new protections for women around sort of measures to make the court experience more easy for them, and it widened the definition of domestic abuse. But there are still massive gaps. So there's a real lack of support for women with, for example, insecure immigration status. So women kind of not from the UK, migrant women, often don't have what they call recourse to public funds, which basically means that they can't access the necessary government support to be able to pay for a stay in a refuge. And this is a real issue for so many migrant women. And the rules around that are so complicated, and I think it's even more complicated now that we've left the EU. So I think one of the things that we really need to be organising around is how to make sure that those gaps in support for women with insecure immigration status are really, we have to fill those gaps, because we have these new legal definitions, but that's only as good as kind of the protection that women are actually getting in real terms. So I think that's kind of what I would say. Those are the two main areas: sort of building for sort of longer term power, and also thinking about the gaps in gender-based violence provision.
Yeah, thank you for this again insights and very important emphasis. And Katerina, what do you think? What we can do and where we need to concentrate much more?
Yeah. First of all, I would like to probably state my skepticism. If the pandemic, which I'm not sure whether we are through, I don't think it has complete. It has finished yet. So, in case the pandemic is followed by an economic crisis, in such a case, I'm afraid economic issues will have preference over human rights issues. And there are so many topics within the women's rights movements to fight for. In our case, it's again, we are just obsessed with the gender pay gap. Definitely, we are also obsessed with the ratification of the Istanbul Convention. And we, as Marisha has mentioned, we haven't got enough women or the sufficient numbers of women in decision-making positions. We haven't got enough female politicians. So there are so many issues. However, I'm just really concerned. I believe that all our agenda, firstly, will be affected by the fact whether there is an economic crisis following the pandemic. And then in a concrete case of the Czech Republic, the feminist agenda will be heavily affected by the parliamentary elections. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for all your concerns, shared concerns and thoughts and insights. We strictly follow actually the time, and we're done with our questions. And we now have a time for question and answer session from our audience. So dear audience, please feel free to put your questions either in a chat box or raise the question so that we could see your hand, or just put the question in the chat box and we'll have a chance to ask our panelists. And one more thing, if it's because we already have some questions, it's not too late. Once asking a question, if this question is addressed to a specific panelist, please also mention the name so that we know who is the responsible person for this question to answer. If not, we will just give a chance to all our panelists and let them decide who wants to cover this. So we have from a participant, and it's to everyone. Let's see what is written. In Georgia, and not only, pandemics can both incite and exacerbate violence against women. Economic insecurity, social isolations, and reduced health services availability are all contributing factors to increase in violence during outbreaks like COVID-19. So I guess it's not like a question, but it still is kind of like shared experience or remarks from our participants. So it's interesting, what is the experience of other countries and relevant ways to solve the problem. Yeah, so this is one remark we have from one of our participants. I will still wait for some other audience members to raise their questions. Please feel free to raise the question if you have any. If not, we will move on with, because I still have left some questions which are, I think I was making a notes, and I think that they are also important to be addressed by our panelists. At the moment, we don't have a question, so what I would suggest, I will ask a question, and please, Nar, meanwhile, you just follow the flow of chat box. If we have got a question there, just be sure to address it. So I've got a question to Marisha, actually. Marisha, the way COVID-19 was addressed, or as you presented it, even we could say unaddressed by Belarusian authorities, was one of the triggers for the revolution in Belarus that is claimed to be a revolution with a woman's face. How much did the role of women in Belarus increase in reality?
That's a very good question, because what happened in Belarus is, of course, when the government did not react to COVID and demonstrated total kind of, I would say, even insanity in a way, and it caused lots of jokes, of course, and then it actually created a huge movement that was supporting the healthcare specialists with the protection, like to work in the hospitals, because even this wasn't provided, and they collected lots of money that was then distributed, like different stuff was bought. So so this was actually the first step to understanding that it has to be really changed. And then what happened also is that when we had the presidential election campaign, the government of Lukashenko, especially, he was making different kind of statements about women, that a woman cannot actually become a good president. Yes, and this is anti-constitutional to have a woman as a president. She will not be able to deal with that. So we were making, of course, lots of jokes, but this is also what made women to go to the streets. And actually, people voted for a woman president. We have, and according to the surveys, 80% of people, 82%, are ready to vote for a woman in power now. So I think this is a huge shift. Another thing is that, unfortunately, still there is underrepresentation of women in the oppositional structures for the moment. For example, so in the headquarters of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, there are only men. This is very weird, because 3 women were running the election campaign, and we were voting for women. Then in the coordination council that was created to ensure the transfer of power, men again are dominating. We didn't even manage to push for the advisor on gender equality in the headquarters of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, because they say that gender equality is not the issue for the moment. So domestic violence is not the issue for the moment. We have to get rid of current regime, and then we will deal with other stuff. So, but it has to go in parallel. Yes, we cannot disregard many other things that are happening. So this is, in a way, very disappointing. But on the other way, also, we are participating as feminists very actively in the revolution, and we're hoping that later on we will still have our say on many things. I don't know if I have to answer the question of Mariam. Tell me, please.
If you wish, this is kind of like a shared experience or remark. But if you want to add anything on this, you are mostly welcome, more than welcomed.
I would say that in most of the countries and regions, so there was actually the cooperation was enhanced, yes, between the police, for example, different ministries and civil society organizations. But what happened in Belarus is that all non-governmental organizations who are dealing with domestic violence, they made the statement, and they are not cooperating anymore with the police and with other ministries as well, because all the ministries and the police are engaged into torturing people now in jails, persecution of activists and women activists, and different structures. They are actually threatening women to take away their kids, yes, and limit their parenting rights. So this is why in Belarus it's a very, very specific case, and we see also that there is the rise of violence because people are very angry generally. So of course there is the rise of violence, on domestic violence, because people have lots of tension. But women, they don't address police. We were making the research, and they say also that even before, like at the beginning of the revolution, what was happening, they were saying, I will not address the police because my problem and domestic violence is much less. Other people are in much worse situation. They were tortured in prison. So comparing to them, I was just beaten up by my partner. That's fine. I can deal with that. So this is also this kind of thing that women are disregarding, and they don't realize that they have to put themselves first, not the victim of torture, yes, but they have to put themselves first, and they have to seek for help.
Okay, thank you, Marisha. And we have got a question to Ran. Ran, the question runs as follows: how
sorry,
have
Annie, sorry. Katarina wants to give a quick response. Okay.
Could I add to what Marisha has just mentioned? The situation regarding victims of gender-based violence in the Czech Republic is very, very similar to the situation in Belarus. I've read some research stuff, and women, they just they forget about themselves. They don't want to report domestic violence or gender-based violence because they believe that the pandemic is just much worse, and then they just don't care. They have to wait. So the approach of women is probably quite similar in different countries.
Yeah. Thanks, Katerina. And the question to Ryan: how have feminists based in the UK been affected, and what strategies are they using to adopt? This is a particular question on feminists.
Sure. So I think there have been some real challenges, but also some opportunities as a result of the pandemic. So I think one of the things that's been particularly good for feminist activism in the UK during the pandemic is that we've kind of been forced into new organising strategies. So the possibilities of remote organising, so things like Zoom calls, what it's meant is that more feminists can access meetings and become involved, especially those with, for example, caring responsibilities, or disabled feminists, or other people who might be perhaps more geographically remote and unable to meet sort of in person. So it's really sort of brought together a lot of people that perhaps would not otherwise have got in touch. So I spoke a little earlier about the laws around increased police powers, and in sort of a very, very short amount of time, there were hundreds of people on a Zoom call sort of talking about how to organize around that, and sort of, I think, broader coalitions between different organizations are also being built, which is perhaps a lot more difficult in person. So I think there have been a lot of good opportunities. Of course, then there's the flip side of that that I also wanted to talk about. So I mentioned the vigil for survivors of gender-based violence around the murder of Sarah Everard, and the kind of the way that the COVID restrictions were used to criminalize and essentially crush that protest on the basis that it apparently was breaching the COVID legislation, where sort of earlier in the day we saw sort of women from the royal family gathering at the place where the vigil was, and nobody arrested them. But somehow sort of feminist organisers and activists are being arrested and suffering police brutality for gathering. And the COVID restrictions, I think, have been used as a screen for that. And I think the other sort of main thing to talk about is really this kind of overwhelming increase in gender-based violence, and how survivor services have been really overwhelmed during the lockdowns. It's really starkly highlighted those issues. So I think a lot of feminists, particularly those delivering frontline services to survivors, are kind of exhausted and kind of burnt out. But then we also have this real sort of radicalization of sort of other women and new activists brought about as a result of kind of the remote organizing and the way that we're able to reach more people. So it's kind of advantages and disadvantages, really.
Yeah, I see. I totally agree. So it has double sides, two sides. And we have got a question which is addressed to Katrina. Katrina, the question is the following: do you perceive any differences in the topics raised by women's rights movements in different countries? So I believe that it's connected with the fact that we probably talked about certain issues that most of them are shared somehow in our countries. They are not isolated, they do not exist separately, of course, they action like a chain, but still there is a question: do you perceive any differences in the topics raised by women's rights movements in different countries? And it's not mentioned, do they mean during the pandemic, or I believe in the pandemic probably. So we have learned about the case of Belarus, which is a little bit like different, connected with politics. But what about probably other countries or in the region? What do you think?
Thank you very much for the question. Before answering it, I've heard the expression, the adjective exhausted in Ryan's contribution, and I would like to confirm that Czech feminists and also Czech female academics are exhausted at the moment, because they are the ones who, in fact, just for 1 year and several months, they have been working, cooking, working as cleaners, cleaning ladies, and having a proper job at the same time. And it's very difficult, to cope and to manage all these roles. And moreover, if you have a kid, so in the Czech Republic, for some time, you became a full-time teacher. So we are exhausted. Full stop. And then, your question. I perceive that there are country-specific issues. I can compare, for example, the Visegrad countries. I'm not sure if you know, there are 4 Visegrad countries in the Central European region, namely Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, and then the Czech Republic. Within these 4 countries, I can see that there are country-specific topics. I've already mentioned that, like in the Czech Republic, I wouldn't say the topic number 1, but an important topic for the women's movement is gender pay gap, unlike in other 3 Visegrad countries. For example, what is, I would say, number 1 topic for women's movement in Poland is the right to abortion, which is, has never been discussed in the Czech Republic. Women's movement in Slovakia is underfinanced, and at the moment, for example, Slovakia has no representation in the European women's lobby, and we can see that in Hungary and in Poland, politically speaking, even like the democratic processes are in danger. nowadays. And then when I can compare, for example, the European women's lobby as such, so I can see a sort of like, it's just like a difference in interest in the topic of gender identity. Yeah, and this topic has been discussed in Western European countries for quite some time, and it's very new agenda within our region, within the Central European region, and I would say Eastern European countries. And if I could, for example, ask a question to my colleague Marisha, so I was just wondering what this topic of gender identity, does this mean anything to you? To your movement? Have you got any opinion of it? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Catherine. And yes, please, Marisha, if you have anything to share on this with us, please.
Yeah, we have a lot of discussions on gender identity, and we have also very strong queer movement in Belarus that is also actively participating now in the revolution. But the thing is that before the revolution started, I don't know, I think it's good what happened, of course, because the anti-gender movement, together with churches, especially together with the Catholic Church, which is very disappointing, but very, very predictable. So they were collecting, and they collected, I think, around 75,000 signatures to introduce the law on, similar to the law in Russia, on anti-LGBTQ plus propaganda. Yes, so meaning that nobody can discuss with children gender identity and so on. So luckily, this process was stopped for the moment. So for the moment, the government has no possibility to work on this stuff. And of course, this is was quite a good luck. Yes, so we didn't face this kind of thing. But of course, the churches and the religious non-governmental organizations, they're trying, and they are confronting with our movement, for example, because they say that we cannot talk about gender identity, or we cannot raise this issue. So I think that in our region, so these topics are becoming very much demonized, the same as feminism. And we actually support a lot the queer movement and do a lot for them. Yes, so to raise the awareness about different things. And I think that also from my research, what I saw when I was doing this research on feminist movements in the region, that were very much in all of the countries connected to LGBTQ plus movements and organizations, and cooperate a lot on different issues, especially gender-based violence.
Thank you. Thank you all. And now I've got a question, like a technical, very technical question to our audience. Dear audience members, if you still have questions or comments or remarks, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask either your question or share your remarks and comments and opinion with us. We still have some time. Please feel free. Okay, if we don't have any remarks anymore, I would like really smoothly to pass to our wrap-up conclusion. And I would like our panelists, each of you will have from 1 to 2 minutes to conclude. If you have anything to say, add, or just conclude whatever we have discussed. And we will be done with our very interesting, at the same time, very important discussion. Thank you. So, Ryan, probably we'll start with you.
Sure. So I guess I just wanted to sort of reflect really briefly on how I think so many of the issues are shared across the sort of different regions that we've discussed, often with different emphasis. So really interesting to hear, for example, about the Czech Republic and how the gender pay gap is top of the agenda when our government is saying, oh no, we're just not going to report on that for 2 years. So that's really fascinating, sort of how things are so different. But I wanted to sort of very briefly, I think, say something about the issue of gender identity, which Katerina just brought up. And just to say that this is a huge issue in the UK, particularly this week. And so I just wanted to kind of reassert really solidarity with sort of trans, non-binary comrades and siblings, and just to say that, you know, oppression is oppression, and I feel that it is really the role of the feminist movement to stand in solidarity with the queer movement, and to sort of recognize that, you know, where there's one form of oppression, you know, others follow. And there are some really quite disturbing links, I think, between the sort of anti-trans lobby and sort of other right-wing concerns. So just to sort of say that that's an issue here too, but sort of unwavering solidarity with those comrades and siblings who are experiencing that oppression.
Yeah, thanks. Katerina, please, if you have anything to add or just wrap up whatever we have discussed, or whatever you want to just as a finish, as a conclusion for our discussion.
You know, in conclusion, I would like to thank very much on behalf of Czech feminists to the European Union. In 2004, the Czech Republic joined the European Union. We became a member country, and we can see a lot of positive influence on gender equality in the countries thanks to the membership. And also, I would like to emphasize that in our legislature, we have gender equality de jure. We have an excellent Anti-Discrimination Act. However, there's still a long way to go towards achieving gender equality de facto. Thank you.
Thank you. And please, Mauricia, your state, you're saying.
I think that listening to what we were saying, I have a feeling that also feminist activists face more issues now as activists, yes, in many senses. And I think that in the upcoming year, we should focus more on providing sort of rehabilitation for feminist activists, especially those who are working a lot and are persecuted now by different authoritarian regimes. And I think that, of course, the issue of mental health was always on the agenda, especially for activists. But we see now that due to COVID, yes, it impacted really badly people generally, but especially those who were very much engaged into providing different services. Many women, and especially feminists, they were also, for example, first time when there were like lack of masks, they were even producing the masks. Yes, in the country, they were doing lots of things. So I think that we have also to think and maybe even invest into this sort of rehab programs so that we can bring more energy and also support psychologically feminist activists in the region.
Thank you. This has been all very, very insightful, dear panelists, and we have lots of thanks also from our audience in our chat box. What I want to say as a conclusion from what you have shared with all of us, I have learned that the pandemic is not just a health issue for sure. And unfortunately, no one has canceled it yet. And it has been, and it's still kind of like a big shock for all of us, for our women communities, local communities. And we, women, definitely have been and are still at the heart of heat. But I'm sure that we are not only at the heart of heat, but we are also at the center of its recovery, at the center of recovery in our local communities. And I believe that it's really important. I know that we're all exhausted, and especially those, as Mauricia mentioned, those who have been directly working on the front lines and providing different services, including also feminist activists and researchers, experts also in the field. But I believe that it's really important from time to time to gather together, to raise awareness, share experiences, concerns, even failures, and lessons learned and best practices. Thank you all for for your time and for your readiness to share all this not very easy and joyful moments that you have experienced or you have learned about, but very important episode experiences and thoughts with us. I wish good luck with your work, and I suggest to hope for a better future together. Thank you again, indeed. That was really, really insightful. And I want to tell our audience to be in touch and stay tuned with the other upcoming events with EENCE discussions, because this was the first EENCE discussion today that we launched, but we're going to have a number of discussions. And as I've already mentioned, we're going to, on each discussion, we're going to focus on one specific topic connected with this or that sustainable development goals. Thank you, everyone, and wish you go. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for your active participation. Thanks to the amazing speakers for sharing and caring about the topic and living their lives in a gender justice and gender equality, devoting a lot of programs and events to fight against discrimination and stereotypes. Thank you to the audience for their questions and for their time. See you next time during EENCE Club. Please follow eence.eu for the updates about upcoming events. And sorry for these technical issues and problems, because I see that we have more than 5 Narina technicians. I don't know how it is, but still, yeah, wish you a nice continuation of your work and see you. Bye. Thanks, Annie, for a kind contribution, and thanks for investing your time to moderate and to prepare such an interesting, useful, and meaningful panel discussion. Thank you, Marisha, Karina, and Ryan.
The honor is totally mine. And as we promised, we will send the links once we get from our panelists. Those who have registered for this discussion will get the links to useful resources. Thank you all.
Thank you.